this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. This segment in our series on score reading is about techniques for score reading. If you're new to score reading, I recommend that you start off with something that's pretty straightforward and easy to read, like, say, a string quartet, or a Baroque concerto, maybe an early classical symphony. Some work where there isn't too many staves per page. It can get to be kind of confusing if the very first score that you read is some enormous work like the Planets, where you might have up to 32 staves going at once on a page. I would say keep it simple at first. A string quartet is great because you can just really follow each part, and it also teaches you a lot about string writing. Early classical symphonies are models of balance, especially when you consider that the string sections of those times, back when these pieces were written, were actually fairly small. The string portion of the orchestra might only be like 20 players. When you consider that balanced against the winds and the brass and the timpani that they had, that really does say something about those scores. So I would say also try to make your first few pieces case studies, okay? And it should be something that you really love too, maybe something that you're already familiar with. Let's say that you really like the Mozart Jupiter Symphony, or maybe the Prokofiev Classical Symphony. That's also a good basic classical style symphony with fairly straightforward orchestration and not too many parts per system. In some of our other segments, we've discussed a little bit about how to get orchestral scores without spending a huge amount of money. What's important to think about is that when you download a score from IMSLP, which is the free online music resource, you can actually run into some costs in printing it out on large size paper. The cost of printing nowadays, the fact that a lot of printers that are actually fairly good have very small and expensive cartridges, you can end up spending actually more to print out a full-size score than it would actually cost to purchase a Dover edition of the same exact score. So you might want to think about that if it's something that you really do need to thumb through the pages. Now, another way about that, instead of breaking the bank and spending, say, $3,000 or $4,000 on scores, which you really don't need to do, you might consider making a purchase of getting a vertical screen for your computer. That's what I've got, and I actually use it to score on so that I can actually see everything all at once. And it's an enormous boon for compositional reasons, and it's also really great for reading scores downloaded from IMSLP because it makes the staves the size that they would be on a conductor's score or larger. Set of procedures to follow if you are just getting into score reading. First one I would say is to listen to the work without the score, and listen to it a few times until you get familiar with it. Like I was saying before, something that you like and are familiar with already is a good place to start, or maybe a new work that you really want to kind of test your reading skills on is also good, but I would say get familiar with it with your ear first. Now, the next step I would say is sit down with your score in hand and with the piece that you're going to listen to, and most preferably on an MP3 player, or let's say you're listening to something on YouTube, that's also ideal. Anything where you can move the playhead of what you're listening to back and forth very, very easily, instead of some CD players where it's very, very hard to access the exact moment that you want to go. The sort of fast-forward mechanism really takes a while and you're not really even sure where you are. MP3 players are best for this because you can just really kind of zero in exactly where you want to, and possibly even just set up a repeat mode over a certain series of bars that you want to study. Now what do? I would say focus on small sections. Maybe start with just a single movement of say a quartet or of a symphony, and listen to that with the score in hand several times. As you're just getting started, I would say focus on things that are easy to follow, like the melody, maybe some big entrances on percussion, maybe the bass line, things like that. And as you go, try to train yourself to absorb the information not just horizontally but vertically. Try to really grasp a large amount of information at a time. It's similar as to reading text. When you're a beginning reader, you just notice letters of the alphabet, and then you sort of absorb entire words all at the same time. Then when you get to be an adult reader, you tend to read in terms of phrases. You basically absorb everything up to the comma, just in one gulp. So it's the same exact way with score reading. You have to learn to just look at everything that's happening and just really pick it up. And then, of course, when you score read several times over the same piece, that gives you the luxury of going back and noticing different things. When I was first starting out score reading, I really didn't have anybody to give me any guidance. So what I did was I just went through the entire score, instrument by instrument. And that did teach me a lot about how to write for each part, but it didn't really teach me a lot about how the instruments worked together, how the sections work as choirs with and against each other. So there are many different ways to score read, and I would say the first way to do it is to really try to absorb as much information as you can, and to also see which relevant parts in the music tend to double each other or to complement each other. Once you've got a pretty good grasp of the melodic structure and development of the piece, I would say go back over it and look at all the other bits, okay? Look for the harmonic, contrapuntal, and orchestral texture. How do all those elements work? Look for the balance of the different elements. What register are certain things in each instrument? Which instruments double each other? What are the different dynamic levels? Not just sequentially, not just horizontally, but simultaneously. What's the rhythmic density? How many pieces are playing how many notes within each bar opposed to each other? Also look at the individual function of each part. How is it flowing through the score? What is it saying? How is it supporting the musical idea? Look at the dynamic and emotional curves overall and how they're achieved. That's something that a conductor is really going to be focusing on, and so should you. And then when you take that information and write your own score, maybe you'll have something that a conductor can really dig into. So after you've done this, and I would hope that you would take the time to read each score, especially at first, many times, say, half a dozen times at least. So let's say you've gotten fairly familiar with the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth. I would say read over the score now without listening to it. And follow it along. Let the notes on the page speak to the orchestra in your mind and tell it what to do. Okay? That is really how you're going to develop your ability to read a score without having to have it backed up by an audio track and to hear it in your own head. Okay? And that's the reason why I want you to study these scores intensely, especially the first few scores that you grab. Once again, make sure that it's music that you are familiar with or that you enjoy very much, music that you can relate to, music that is simple enough to stay in your head, okay? And then a lot of this will start to fall into place. It's going to take a while. You're not going to turn into an expert score reader overnight. It might take, even a few years before you feel very, very confident in your score reading abilities. But don't despair, because there's so many great scores out there. This is an opportunity that very few people have. Just think about it, when you are getting to the end of the score and you've read every note, just what a rush that is. It's like no other way of absorbing artistic information that I know of. And, I hope that you enjoy it as much as I have.